3 months ago, there weren't enough masks. We were desperately sourcing from all over the world. People were making face coverings from scarves and bits of fabric. Now there are plenty of masks, but some people don't want to wear them. Come on, mask up, America.
Brought to you by the Ad Council.
The organizer of the foot race was Charles C. Pyle. Flamboyant and flashy, Pyle was known as the P.T. Barnum of sports promotion.
We have runners from all over the world. You can see them along the line, and they'll all walk and run but myself. I'll ride. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Brown.
The Route 66 Highway Association offered Pyle a $60,000 contract to run the race down Route 66, the main street of America. Pyle spent $25,000 on a personal touring coach, the America. He spent another $25,000 on a bus for race officials. Pyle explained his grandiose plan. We'll get a big field of famous runners. We'll race them through hundreds of towns. Each town will be assessed so much by me for advertising, or we won't run through it. Then we'll sell 1 million programs. Easy. I'll make money on that too. In fact, it's about the easiest thing I've ever seen.
It's May 26, 1928, and Bunion Derbyists who started in Los Angeles 84 days earlier enter New York and the end of a 3,000-mile walk. 55 contestants are close to the finish now. And in Madison Square Garden, they swivel hip several turns around the track before breaking the tape. And the winner is Andrew Payne of Claremore, Oklahoma. The first prize, $25,000.
Behind Andy, Johnny Salo, the shipyard worker from New Jersey, placed second. Philip Granville, the Canadian walking champion, came in third. After racing through hundreds of towns and selling thousands of race programs, Pyle is broke.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right, let's get this show on the road, shall we? How are you doing, everybody? My name is Tim Hanlon. It's Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. Thanks for coming by. It's our 200th episode. Holy mackerel is all I can say. Nothing necessarily special planned in this episode, although the topic is unique and is indicative of some of the things that we like to kind of it's a detour around or to in our collective journeys into things such as defunct teams and leagues. We also love to kind of relish in various forms of professional sports in the realm of events, things that may have been one-time onlys or very short-lived series, those kinds of things. Even, frankly, the places in which said events might have taken place. We've done many episodes on old stadiums and arenas and that kind of stuff. This week is very much in that category for sure. And our guest this week is the author of a fantastic book. His name is Geoff Williams, and the book, as you sort of got a hint at the clip there at the top of the show, is around a unique and arguably very head-scratching event that occurred in 1928 as well as also in 1929. And we'll get to sort of the idiosyncrasies around that in a few moments with Geoff Williams, our guest this week. The book he has written is called C.C. Pyle's Amazing Foot Race, the true story of the 1928 coast-to-coast run across America. Now, what is this? Okay, this is a story about a competition, a literal foot race across the country that was known as officially as the Trans-American Foot Race, informally, more popularly, as the Bunion Derby. Now, this was a foot race put together by a guy by the name of Charles C. Pyle, CC for short. nicknamed Cash and Carry Pyle. Now, we'll get into whether that was an affectionate or derisive nickname coming up. But this is a fascinating character who was very much involved in sports and sports promotion. In many respects, C.C. Pyle, the avatar for what is today a profession known as the sports agent. C.C. Pyle was effectively the first modern-day sports agent. Now, some would say huckster, some would say PR guy, some would argue sort of, P.T. Barnum-esque. Those are not individually all applicable, although I guess you could shake vigorously and sort of come up with this interesting character, C.C. Pyle. It was his idea in the late 20s, the roaring 20s, just before it all sort of came crashing, literally and figuratively, to a halt, to put on this spectacle, this cross-country foot race, challenging men. I don't think women were allowed to participate. So, we're talking about clearly another generation for sure. But this was literally a 3,000-plus mile event where, for cash prizes, the top 10 finishers that ran the trek in 1928 from Los Angeles to New York City, ending in Madison Square Garden, of all places, would win fabulous cash prizes. And C.C. Pyle, essentially learning from his own, pioneering efforts in, it wasn't even a thing at the time, sports agentdom, cutting his teeth with one Red Grange. He of the American football scene in the 1920s, basically created a brand for Grange and essentially translated him from a college football phenomenon to more than that, as a member of the Chicago Bears, and not only playing for the team, but barnstorming and personal appearances and all kinds of things using the Red Grange name and aura. Stuff we remember today. That was all Cash and Carry Pyle's doing. C.C. Pyle was the guy, the sort of chief cheerleader and opportunity seeker and finder for Red Grange. Also a very famous French tennis player at the time, Suzanne Lenglen, who was a Wimbledon winner, multiple U.S. Open appearances and success. That was back in the day when those were inhabited only by amateurs. And C.C. Pyle, back in the roaring 20s, when all kinds of crazy stuff was going on, flagpole sitting and dance marathons and all that stuff. Hey, why not create a professional circuit for tennis players? That, too, a pioneering thing by C.C. Pyle. So, by the way, this is a guy also who created for us, sports history aficionados. He was also the founder of a very short-lived league, the original American Football League in 1926. He was the founder as well as a team owner of 3 of those teams, the Boston Bulldogs, the Chicago Bulls, and the Los Angeles Wildcats, and yes, even the original New York Yankees football team, which started in the AFL, which collapsed relatively quickly after one season, a challenger to the still fledgling National Football League, which arguably got its start around 1920 or so. But the New York Yankees actually was the sole, I think the only team that survived, I wouldn't call it a merger, but jumped from the AFL to the NFL. And yes, the New York Yankees were a football team as well as the New York Yankees baseball team. C.C. Pyle was behind all of that stuff. Hard to believe, right? Well, certainly it seems that this is a guy, if anybody is going to create a spectacle around something like a foot race around across the country. And this is something that takes place over a couple of months, is going to stop at various towns and cities along the way. Lots of publicity. This is a guy, even you will find out later with our conversation with Geoff Williams in just a few moments. He bought a bus and created a rolling radio transmitter, even before radio was kind of a big thing. And he would literally do broadcasts from the road. I mean, he was the inventor of the radio promotion or the radio remote. This is a character and then some, C.C. Pyle. But we're going to really spend most of our time with Geoff talking about this, I think you could call it signature event in CC Pyle's life. Despite all those crazy things, this foot race, the Bunion Derby, as it was known, the Trans-American foot race, and we're going to get into all of it. It is just the people who got drawn to participating in this. Fascinating stories. Why Pyle was intrigued with this idea. The ease with which he suspected he would be able to make money off of this proposition. The promotional opportunities. He launched this around the same time the mother road, Route 66, was officially coming online, and perfect timing because this was a road race, a foot road race, that the first part of which, the first arguably 2/3 of which, actually would run and simultaneously promote Route 66, the Los Angeles to Chicago portion. All kinds of crazy roads and infrastructure challenges from Chicago's points eastward to New York. We'll get to that too as well. And then again, who is this guy? Where's the money coming from? Would he pay off? But the amazing stories of the people who decided they were going to try for this are heartbreaking, noble people trying to pay for, things like education and their parents' mortgages and all kinds of other situations and rationales for running this race. But this is what it was. Again, it was called the Trans-American Foot Race, i.e. AG, also known as, the Bunion Derby. We're going to get into that fascinating sports story from 1928 and 1929 with our guest this week, Geoff Williams, the author of CC Pyle's Amazing Foot Race, the book. Fascinating stuff coming up in just a few moments. This is a truly special conversation in just a few moments. One sponsor that we'll highlight this week and get on to the proceedings. Let's try Streaker Sports. StreakerSports.com. That's the place to go. They call themselves the purveyors of sports culture. And once you go to StreakerSports.com and check out all the great stuff that they've got, you'll see immediately why. All kinds of great stuff. So let's start probably with the meat of the matter, the defunct leagues section. Roller Hockey International. How about the ABA, the WHA, the Western Hockey League? How about the North American Soccer League? How about the Major Indoor Lacrosse League? Remember the World Football League? How about Pro Beach Hockey? Maybe even the International Hockey League and more. All these great leagues commemorated. USFL, did I mention them? Just about every team in all of those leagues in great, comfortable, well-crafted T-shirt form. All kinds of amazing stuff. You a fan of the movie Slapshot? Sure. Hey, you want to remember some of the founding years of some of your favorite current sports franchises? They've got those too. You get into Caddyshack? They got that too. How about the Onions collection? The Bill Raftery trademark. All kinds of great stuff, both classic and ongoing. You name it. It's sports culture at its finest, and great T-shirts and other stuff too at our pals at StreakerSports.com. Streaker Sports, the purveyors of sports culture. And don't forget, once you're finding the amazing stuff that you want to put into your cart, make sure that you add the promo code GOODSEATS in that cart to get 15% off all of your purchases when you go there early and often. Again, StreakerSports.com, and promo code is GOODSEATS for 15% off all of your purchases. We thank Streaker Sports for their sponsorship of the show, and we thank you for checking them out and obliging us and them with your time and hopefully your hard-earned dollars. So some great stuff. All right, let us move casually and comfortably, shall we, into a dynamic and fantastic and just a raft of knowledge to come. In our conversation, here it is with Geoff Williams. We're going to talk about this amazing foot race, the Bunion Derby from 1928 and a little bit of 1929. The CC Pyle created extravaganza, cross-country foot race. It is fascinating to no end, and here's our conversation we had just last week. As always, please enjoy. This little silly show has been obsessively focused on various situations, I guess, in pro sports, largely U.S. and North American, and intrigued by largely things like defunct teams and leagues that have sort of come and gone. And interestingly, as we'll kind of allude to a little bit in this story, right, there is a little bit of overlap with that sort of, let's say, classic forgotten sports kind of dynamic, if we can even take the liberty of doing that, calling it that after 3 years of this pursuit. But we're also fascinated by, things that are related that tend to be more, shall we say, situational or event driven, that really weren't part of leagues or teams or whatever, because that's also part of the sports landscape. And a lot of those things we just keep unraveling into just more and more intrigue about stuff. I never knew about this kind of event, regardless of the timing of it, right? I mean, just the idea of being able to, make a profit or make a promotion out of a 3,000+ mile run, literally across the country. I mean, it just seems borderline insane, but yet indeed it was a real thing, and then some. And before we get to it, though, give me some background about you. Like, how did you stumble across this topic? What's your profession? Was it just sort of a general interest in personally? You're a runner by what's your, like? How did you even stumble across this story?
Well, I'm a freelance, journalist, and I mean, in terms of stumbling on the story, I think I was like 30, or I'm 51, so it's probably at least 20 years ago. I might have been in my 20s. Now that I think about it, I was. So I was somewhere in my 20s, and I remember I was on my parents' sofa, probably some visiting them, and I was reading a reference book. And it was probably a page and a half in this reference book that mentioned, the Bunion Derby. That's the nickname, for the race. And I read about it, and like you, I was like, what? This was something that really happened. And anyway, I was just mesmerized by the story. I mean, I read a little about it, and it just captured my imagination immediately. With the idea of running across the entire country and winning this cash prize, and then just the fact that it was in the 1920s, 1928, before sneakers, not before paved roads, but paved roads were like a new thing, and they were running on dirt roads and gravel, and it just sounded magical, and I mean magical in terms of a story. And I guess what I loved was I was like, nobody's heard of this. I was like, this writer has in this reference book, but I really felt like I was discovering something, and I just thought this would make a great book. And at the time, I didn't have a book. I mean, I wasn't an author, but I just kept thinking, I've got to do this as a book at some point. I think maybe 5 or 6 years later, I finally, found an agent and pitched it, and pitched a lot of book ideas, but she liked that one, and I loved that one, and so suddenly I'm doing it. Anyway, I don't know if I'm rambling.
No, that's so. I mean, what was the hook that kind of drew you in? Was it the sport? Was it the Roaring '20s? Right. This is obviously just before kind of the beginnings of the Great Depression, and that came after. Was it America at the time? What was the hook that made, or is it just sort of a spark that just you can't define?
Well, I mean, that was the spark, just reading about it. And then as I started doing research on it more and more, I mean, I just fell in love with everything. I definitely fell in love with the time. I mean, the 1920s, the Roaring '20s were far more interesting than I realized. Growing up, you see a little about it, but I really never paid a lot of attention to it. And I guess like with anything, I just started, when I started doing research, even before I knew it was going to be a book, I just started thinking like, well, how did this happen? I mean, I wound up researching, the history of shoes, the history of podiatry, the history of roads, and just kind of everything. And then what I realized at some point and found was that this race didn't just happen one day where C.C. Pyle, the guy who started this, he didn't just wake up one day and say, "Oh, I think I'm going to do this race." This was all part of the endurance competition fad, which is something I really didn't know that much about growing up either. I'd heard of dance marathons, but there was that one movie, They Shoot Horses, Don't They?, with Jane Fonda in the 1970s. Or no, 1969, I think. Anyway, I'd heard of that. But again, all of this I just barely knew anything about it. So I would just keep digging, and a lot of this was general history that I just didn't know. But as I was learning about it, I just gripped me. I mean, they had, flagpole sitting was a big thing. It's all sort of, if you, in the 1920s, they had just finished World War I, and they had their own pandemic, and of course, and the influenza, and millions of people died. And so by the 1920s, when all that is over, I think people just really wanted to have fun, and the economy started coming back, and people were, weekends were more of a thing. For a long time in the 1800s, you were working Saturdays and maybe you had Sundays off. But anyway, so 1920s, you've got a lot of leisure time, and people are excited and happy, and they want to have fun. And so people, they start doing things like the dance marathons, and the first one, I think, was, I don't know how long, we'll just say 20 hours. And so people are like, wow, that was really cool. We should do another one. And, let's make it 30 hours. And then suddenly it's like, let's make it 2 weeks. And, and so this all sort of fed off another. One guy sits on a flagpole, Shipwreck Kelly was, I can't remember, Alvin, I think was his first name. But anyway, he, sits on a flagpole, and other people are like, well, I can do that longer. And then Shipwreck Kelly is like, well, I want to keep my reputation as the best flagpole sitter. So he does it again and longer and all that. And suddenly people are like, well, I could do this as a competition. And so you had rocking chair marathons, eating competitions, skipping rope competitions. I think there was a talking competition where people would just talk as long as they could, for like 3 days or whatever. They often had breaks, like with the dance marathons, and really these little breaks, like 5 minutes, an hour, something like that. It was so, you could eat, go to the restroom, maybe take a little quick nap, and that allowed you to do these marathons longer. And, so you'd be going on for days at a time and all of this. So this was kind of the world we had when C.C. Pyle came up with his idea for a cross-country foot race. It would be the endurance competition to end all endurance competitions.
Yeah, I was born in the wrong decade, right? It just sounds like a hell of a lot of fun. A lot of arguably leisure time and stuff, and the extremes of that. It seems to be, it almost has like some haunting overlap with what I guess was the sort of endurance component of bicycle racing as well, the big sort of indoor Madison Square Garden kind of thing where you just go round and around and around for seemingly days on end. It's fascinating, but it's interesting in that that's also sort of the background for this guy who's central to all of this, C.C. Pyle. Charles was, I guess, his first name. But more, I don't know if this is a derisive nickname or one with admiration, but known as Cash and Carry Pyle. To me, and I know you're not sort of a biographer of this Pyle guy, but he's obviously an intriguing figure. I just don't know. First of all, you can explain a little bit about sort of who and what he was. He's a promoter extraordinaire, but born from sort of sports, I guess almost the early template of what a sports manager or agent would be. But he also, it seems to me, he also sort of bears some resemblance, not necessarily physically, to the P.T. Barnums of the world, right? Sort of like showmanship, but maybe even more so. So first of all, who is this Pyle guy? And then sort of where does he sit on the continuum of hucksterism?
Yeah, somewhere, I guess, between I don't want to get political, but, P.T. Barnum and Donald Trump. I mean, I think that Donald Trump and Pyle would get along in some ways. But gosh, C.C. Pyle, I mean, I loved him as a character. I mean, I say character, he was a character for sure. I think you can admire him in a lot of ways. I don't think he was a bad person, but he definitely on the ethics scale, if he would often do things that probably weren't the best. He was born in 1882. He grew up in Delaware, Ohio. His dad died when he was young. His dad was a reverend, and I'm sure that influenced him because, I mean, Pyle was a showman, and, you can just imagine him sitting as a kid, watching his dad, wow the crowd, the parishioners. And so anyway, he grew up in Delaware, and he got into sort of showmanship pretty early. I mean, he was like a high schooler when he actually organized a wrestling match and a bicycle race, which you mentioned. And one of those the bicycle racers was Barney Oldfield. And 3 years later, this was in 1900 when he organized the race. 3 years later, Barney Oldfield would go on to be the first person who would get into a car and race a mile a minute. So, I mean, that's just kind of a nice little, a foreshadowing of what C.C. Pyle would do. Now, the cash and carry, was it a compliment? Was it more admiration? I'd say, or was it an insult? I'd say it was both. People admired Pyle. I mean, he really, he'd come up with an amazing idea and he would, see it out. And he was a real innovator in like sports, in sports. But at the same time, again, he was sort of shady, and he was also often beset with financial problems, and certainly during the race. So he really was kind of this like huckster. I don't think he wanted to be necessarily. I mean, the way he was going to make money through this race was brilliant. It just didn't quite work. And instead of saying, and I can't blame him for not like, if you have this giant race across the entire country and, it's going to last like 3 months, you don't want to say after, 2 weeks, it's really not working out. I'm not making the money I thought. This isn't going as well as, it could. No, you want to keep it going. So, and that was kind of his problem. But I'm sort of jumping ahead, I realize. But in terms of his life, he went out west when he was 18 years old. A doctor told him that he had I don't think I'm going to say this right, pleurisy, I think, or pleurism. It was some sort of lung disease, not a disease, but a condition. And his dad had it, and his dad died from it. So he decided to go out west, the young man. And so he goes out west for his health. And, takes a train, has some money, and, goes off there. And he's robbed, like, almost immediately. So he's in California. He's penniless. He's got to make some money somehow. Well, he thinks back to his, the bicycle race and the wrestling match. So he decides to organize a boxing match. And somehow he ends up, I guess he can't find anyone, he can't find two boxers to do it, but he finds one old miner who is really, in terrible shape. So Pyle thinks, well, maybe I can fight him. So he decides to, he's like 18, 19, in really bad shape, but this miner, he's a senior citizen, I'll get him. So he organizes this boxing match, and you would think who would want to see, an 18-year-old like beat up an 81-year-old or whatever the guy was. He was probably 60. But Pyle, as he often did, just made it a big thing, promoted the heck out of it, and people put money to see this, match. And then Pyle gets into the boxing, ring with the this old miner who's going to clobber, and then Pyle gets decked and beat up, and learns, I guess, either later or during it that the miner is a former boxer and, really knows how to throw a punch. Anyway, Pyle barely survives that. He does make some money off it, though. And then he goes off into Oregon, and I won't give you every little detail of his life, but he becomes an advance manager for a theater troupe. So once again, showmanship. And he goes off from town to town. He goes to towns before the theater troupe gets there, and he talks them up, and, they're going to be amazing. You've never seen anything like this. And so he, you start to see where he becomes, a showman. I mean, at this point, he's only in his 20s. And then it's the night by 1928, he's in his 40s and, middle-aged, and we haven't begun to discuss his sports career. But
that seems to be pretty intriguing, because who knows, specifically how he sort of got into the sports realm. But in many respects, it's almost sort of vanguard, right? In that, in the 20s, obviously, just about everything was sort of flourishing and leisure time and all that stuff. But football, American football, which a topic we've talked about for many, many episodes, right? Very early days, pre-NFL or early NFL. Sort of finding its footing and whatnot. Tennis, right? His representation of a very famous French tennis player at the time, Suzanne Lengyen, who was about as close to an international star. It seems to me that it's almost a perfect combination of this sort of thing of sports, right, which itself is a spectacle, right? Maybe even a little bit more broadly appealing to the masses, if you will, versus, say, mere theater, right? It stands to reason. I mean, I look at his lure, if you will, of Mademoiselle Lengyen, who frankly was, I think, one of the, if not the first. He put together sort of the first sort of professional tennis tour in the United States, which at the time was very controversial. But you clearly get a sense that this is a guy, who has a flair and a talent for what I guess today would be, I don't know, a promoter, an agent, some combination of thereof.
Yeah, I mean, he basically created the whole concept of being a sports agent. I mean, Jerry Maguire, the movie, would have never happened without C.C. Pyle, and basically he came west and somehow wound up in Illinois. By then he was on his third wife. I mean, he had lived quite a life, and he was running a movie theater in the 1920s in Illinois, in Champaign, Illinois, when Red Grange, who became obviously huge football star. By the time he was in college and played an amazing game. And I'm not. I mean, as you can probably tell, I'm not a sports guy. And I'd have to go back to my own book to get some of the details. But basically, Red Grange, he did this amazing game. And the whole crowd, the whole country noticed and was just like, wow, did you see Red Grange? So Red Grange comes into the theater, and C.C. Pyle's there. And, at this moment, C.C. Pyle is like this anonymous, I mean, nobody knows him. He's led a really colorful life. He's done a lot of things, but he's not really anybody, he's certainly not a famous, person. But anyway, C.C. Pyle takes Red Grange aside and, oh, son, can I talk to you? And he talks about, what he can do for Red Grange's career. And sure enough, I mean, he gets him into professional football and basically creates, or, helps create professional football and being a sports agent. And like you said, I mean, he takes, he gets Red Grange into the movies. He gets him branding things. Suddenly he's got a sweater and, I don't know, a lot of different merchandise that Red Grange started promoting. One, he promoted cigarettes, even though Red Grange didn't smoke. But all he had to do was basically say, well, if I were going to smoke, I'm sure I would like this brand. And so, he got money for that. I mean, Pyle was just ingenious with, the way he could market. Yeah, Red Grange, and then Suzanne I can't even say her name the way you can. Glenn. That's the Americanized way, but and she was quite a personality. I mean, she a diva, and I'm sure Pyle kind of created that in a way. He probably was like, "You're amazing, and you're a star, and you should be treated as such." And so she became that. And kind of my theory is that, in a way, maybe he wanted to do this foot race. I mean, it's sort of weird because he had a very successful career as a sports agent with, in football and tennis, and then suddenly he wants to do the foot race. And on one hand, I do think he wanted to capture what was going on in the country with endurance competitions. But at the same time, Red Grange was the star, Suzanne was the star, but C.C. Pyle, with the race, he could kind of be the star. I mean, the race that he if I can say the name of the race, I mean, it was long, but it was called C.C. Pyle's first annual International Transcontinental Foot Race. And, of course, no sports writer wanted to say that. I mean, that was, a mouthful. I mean, you couldn't say that. So somebody, when they heard about this foot race across America, thought of, how your feet would hurt and all that. And so somebody came up with the Bunion Derby. And sports writers just loved that. And so that stuck. And everyone called it the Bunion Derby. And C.C. Pyle hated that, and probably in part because his name, if they'd called it C.C. Pyle's Bunion Derby, I still don't think he would have loved that, but at least his name would have been in there. But yeah, I think that's one of the reasons too why he gravitated to this foot race, because his name was on it, and he could be kind of the showman and promote himself.
Yeah, it's interesting because, and this is probably another topic for another day, but I mean, some people would even credit him, frankly. Well, he's essentially been an avatar, right, for what today is sort of commonplace, right? I mean, he kind of made Red Grange, almost like a brand name, right, in many respects, right? And very ahead of its time, and to a lesser extent, Suzanne Lenglen. Now you got me, I can't even say her name. Look it up, folks. Lenglen. Suzanne with two N's. But it's also, I guess the real big question I have as we sort of get into this is why. We talked about sort of the excitement of endurance races and all that stuff, but why a foot race, right? I mean, he's been playing around literally and figuratively in football and tennis, two, very popular sports, sort of to different audiences. But why foot racing versus, say, some other endeavor, like some other sport activity? I'm curious as to like what was the spark? Maybe you don't even know, but like,
actually, there's a funny. There is a funny story. I don't remember exactly the details, but about a year earlier, there was somebody, there were always like wars and battles and all that. And somebody had to run from one, I think, country to another, basically, and had to deliver a message having related to some sort of war. I mean, it's in my book, and I don't even remember, But anyway, this guy, he was older, probably 50 or something, 60, 68, 67. He was up there. Anyway, he ran like, I'm just guessing because, I can't quite remember, but he ran like 50 miles or 60 miles. And when he came into the town with the message, people were cheering. And just, I guess, word got out, hey, somebody's running with a message. And so all these people are cheering and just so excited and all that. And C.C. Pyle hears about that and thinks, wow, that is amazing. This old guy running, for a good cause and all that. All these people are cheering. And wow, the guy didn't get any money for that. He ran, he had, crowds, cheering for him and no money. Well, C.C. Pyle just thought, that's terrible, And so apparently that was the spark. But I think there were a lot of again, the endurance competition, he's trying to think of something unique. But he came up with this idea, and the reason it was able to make money, the way he saw it and the way he planned it, and it did work to some degree, but you would run from town to town. Every day you basically ran like 1 to 2 marathons. I mean, we're talking a marathon, 26 miles. People were running, 20 to like 50 miles a day, and, the way he structured this. But you'd run from like one city to another city, one town to, another town. And he made sure that just about every time, and then you would sleep for the night. You kind of like the dance marathons, you had to have those 5-minute breaks so that, people wouldn't completely pass out after, say, 8 hours or 18. They could go on for, weeks. So he would have you run, from Los Angeles to, I can't remember the first town, but, you'd run from town to town, and you would sleep in tents and then get up the next day and you'd run again. Okay, and that doesn't sound like, how do you make money off that? Well, he had a tent city put up for everybody to, sleep in. And if you were, if you're cheering, that the Bunion Derby is coming to your town, you're very excited and all that. Well, if you're willing, you'll pay your little 5 cents or whatever to go into the tent city where you can meet the runners and see them. You can get some food. You can get some souvenirs. And so it was kind of like a circus. I mean, the whole thing became like a circus, but it was, kind of like a circus. And so, you could go and, see the sights. And then, of course, if you're a town, or you're a businessman, well, there weren't a lot of business women back then, but, a business owner, you could, you could promote, you could have, a sale if you sold shoes. I mean, that'd be perfect, advertise to the runner and the people in the town and, have a discount, on the shoes that you're selling, restaurant. And people would come to these towns to see the runners. So it was good for business and it was good for Pyle. And then, of course, Pyle made sure that every town, if you're going to host the runners that night, you're going to pay for it. So he made sure that the towns were giving him money, to host these things. So, and then of course he, would, brand it in other ways too, and just become a huge, I mean, the way he figured, huge celebrity. And he planned on running these races every year. And yeah, he just thought he'd be this huge. He basically thought he was inventing a sport, kind of like he was helping to invent, professional football and professional tennis. Just didn't quite work out that way. We don't have a lot of, you've got races, of course, in the Olympics and all that, but transcontinental foot races aren't really a thing anymore.
Well, it's endlessly fascinating, but it also overlaps, though, as I did my sort of cursory research for this, with some other major sort of development going on infrastructure-wise in the United States, and that you alluded to it earlier, which is sort of the paving of roads, and in particular, and I'm just really curious as to sort of which came first, sort of this idea or the marketing behind a just completed Route 66. I'm wondering who found whom for this, because this is part of the story too. It's almost kismet, if you will, between sort of mutual desires here. Pyle, from his own sort of stepping out and running his own and developing and creating his own new thing, just seems to be convenient that this mother road, this brand new gleaming, stretch of asphalt between Chicago and Los Angeles was also kind of getting off the ground, so to speak.
Yeah, and that was a big part of why he decided to run on that. I mean, he had kind of this great road he could use and promote, and the people, behind the highway were happy to have, to bring attention to it. And, but unfortunately for Pyle, the road wasn't, it didn't go across the entire country. And, Yeah, I'm just trying to remember. That's one of where I sort of blank out on that. But
still,
yeah, I mean,
I would imagine it would give him, though, right, an enormous head start, right? Because it's just like, to your point, right? This is sort of, hey, look, I can get all these different cities and towns along that road at least. That I pretty much don't have to worry as much about that one because I'll have a partner, if you will, to
right, exactly,
sort of scout the rest.
And a lot of the roads back then, were not paved. I mean, were dirt roads, and the runners indeed actually ended up running on a lot of dirt roads and gravel and mud, and then of course it snowed on them, so they're running in snow. But so yeah, to have Route 66, a paved road for a lot of the trip was was wonderful, and just like you said, kismet, and it worked out really well. And it's just a fun part of Route 66's history now. I mean, they had the TV show at some point, and starts off with the race, and it's just it's just yet another, I think, really colorful aspect of this whole race. I mean, it's just an amazing story. I mean, I think. I mean, in shoes, we haven't even talked about that. I mean, 1928, you didn't. I mean, sneakers, they existed. There were like Keds, but they weren't. They weren't popular, and there weren't a lot. I mean, it just wasn't a thing. Where you had to really work hard to find sneakers. So for the most part, you didn't have a lot of running shoes, and the people who showed up, to run this race. I mean, there were at least one guy in work boots. There were barefoot runners, which I can't even imagine. And then just a lot of people running in just regular, hard-soled shoes, and those would wear out a lot. And so you would have to, from town to town, you'd have to buy new pairs of shoes. And I can't even, that was another thing that I just loved. I mean, as a teenager, I had tried running. I think I was on the track team for 1 year, and I had I'd done enough running to know that I kind of liked it sometimes and kind of hated it, and I just had so much respect for these people who decided to enter this, because again you're running like the equivalent of 1 or 2 marathons a day.
So
and
who are these people? Like, where is he? I mean, he got almost 200 people for this first race in 1928. Who gets it? I'm trying to get inside the head of like who would be attracted to this, why, and frankly how and where they're sort of coming from to kind of just go for this crazy stunt.
That's the most fun, I think, part of this whole story. I mean, and that, I mean, again, I was sold from the beginning, but when I started researching the people who did this, I just fell in love with this whole story. There were 199 men. C.C. Pyle did say, no women, can't do it. It just, at that time, they didn't believe a woman could run, they knew they could run, but they just didn't think they had the endurance, which was insane and crazy. And it took until like the 1960s that's when, I can't remember, Bobby Gibb, I think was her name. And that's a really neat story if you want to do that sometime. But a woman, didn't pose as a man, but she used her initial, I think, like B. Gibb, or, again, I'm not quite sure what her name was, but she, basically everybody thought she was a man when she entered, and then she enters it, and then people try to stop her because they're like, oh, women aren't allowed in this. So anyway, 199 men in the Bunion Derby, and their ages from 15 to 63. And the 15-year-old lied about his age because he thought, they're not going to let me do this. So he said he was 16, and they were like, oh, okay. He had just turned 15, and that's a neat story, too. I should tell you about that kid. But anyway, ages 15 to 63, most of them are in their 20s, but they're, 30s and 40s as well. And they were, white, black. There were 4 black men. There were Native Americans, quite a few European runners. So you had people from all over. But what's really kind of, I think, just poignant about the whole thing. C.C. Pyle, at first he wanted professional runners. That's what he thought he would get. The world's elite runners. He started having trouble with that. So then he was just like, oh, okay, anybody who can run, as long as you're a man, come on, your money's good here. But Pyle did do a contest. It was a contest, and you got a $25,000 prize. Whoever came in first, and then you had $10,000 for the second, and $5,000 for third place, and I think $1,000 to the rest. The top 10 runners, not everybody. So, that was a lot, as you can imagine. $25,000 in 1928, in today's dollars, would be over $300,000. So, you're talking a lot of money. So, naturally, it brought in, everybody from, just people who were not really thinking this through, like the guy who wore the work boots, to people who were really pretty desperate. And like the 15-year-old, his name, let's see here, Toby Joseph Cotton. I just had to think for a second. Anyway, Toby Joseph Cotton, he was a black boy teenager from Cleveland, I think, somewhere in Ohio. And anyway, his dad was a paraplegic, and he had 6 brothers, and his mom. His dad was a mechanic until he got injured, and then couldn't do his job. So they were in really bad shape, and so Toby wanted to win that $25,000 for his family, and they thought, well, maybe you could do this. But the problem was, for everybody, they all had to give a $125 entry fee, which isn't quite as bad as it sounds. I think when I first heard about it, I thought, oh God, C.C. Pyle, he's going to make money off the runners in this way. But actually, once you finished, you didn't even have to finish the race. Once you dropped out, they would give you $100 of that $125, and that was your way to get back home. So you had travel money. So if you're running from, California to New York, but you give up in Missouri, well, you've got $100. Good luck. So anyway, Toby and his family, they managed to raise the money, and they drove out, from Ohio to Los Angeles, and he ran in the thing, and so you had just a lot of unemployed people who somehow managed to raise this money. I can tell you some of the stories about some of the others, but yeah, just a lot of desperate people, because even though we think of the Great Depression and it was from being 1929 to the 30s, in 1928 it wasn't. There was hints of what was to come, and there was a recession in the farming community, and there were enough people. There were still plenty of people who, $25,000 would have been a game changer, life changer, and so yeah, that it just drew a lot of interesting people to this race.
Do you think Pyle had any sort of worries about sort of like the health and the safety of these guys? And this is an ultra endurance thing. It's one thing to run a marathon. It's another thing to run like 2 of them per day times how many days. Exhaustion, medical health. Insurance. How do you or does he just kind of go for it, and he just doesn't sort of, I can't, if you're a businessman, right, it just cries risk all over the place, right? But it doesn't seem like he's taking that too much into account.
Well, I think on one hand, you had the endurance fads going on, and everybody else was doing it, so he probably thought, well, I can too. There were some people who, if you're dancing for 2 weeks, that's a lot. But he did have he had some sort of medical staff. I think one doctor or something like that on staff, and he arranged it so people, would be able to eat at the tent city and all that. He had a chef who wasn't very good, and then he started giving out meal tickets to, so they could eat at the restaurants, which, the cities, towns doing this liked. He did, yeah. I mean, he wasn't a monster. I mean, I will definitely say that. I think he didn't want people to get injured and all that. On the other hand, one of the runners at some point dropped out, and he brought him on. He hired him. His name was Arthur Newton, and he was a professional runner and just one of the elites. Well, he hires Arthur Newton to become sort of his, a coach. So there would be runners because, well, a lot of runners were dropping out, and that wasn't good for business. I mean, he expected people to drop out, and that's fine. It probably might have been bad for business, if everybody was running, and nobody dropped out. No excitement and all that. But he wanted people to finish. Otherwise, you could have the race end, in the middle of the country because the last person drops out. So anyway, he hires Arthur Newton, and you'd have people who would have, splinchants and, corns, and maybe their knee is starting to give out. And Arthur would talk to him and be like, you're not that bad, right? I mean, you can do it. Come on, you've come all this way. And so anyway, Arthur would talk them into, continuing. So, yeah, Pyle, I think, did what he could to keep them healthy, but he also did what he could to keep them running every day. And so, yeah, as I said, he was, kind of a shifty guy.
Well, there's also a lot of promotion along the way, too. There's a great picture in some of the research that I did of, another, I think, pioneering thing where he hired or helped build out I guess it was called at the time, a portable broadcast station, obviously radio at the time, where he would be basically announcing each evening sort of what sort of transpired, I guess, during that course of that day. And obviously, in the truck, that itself it's almost like the avatar for the radio remote promotion that we sort of know today, like come down to the car dealership for, and get some free stickers or something, right? How else was he promoting this? Because I got to think that the newspapers in each of these towns, as this race was before, during, and after, were just sort of eating this up as sort of as a major event for them.
Oh, they were. And I mean, that's where I got a lot of my research. I mean, I did do things like traveled to Oklahoma and stayed at the house, actually, of one of the runner's kids who, she had a guest house and let me stay there and, looked through scrapbooks. And I interviewed a lot of kids of the runners because the runners, I don't think anybody was alive when I was doing this. But yeah, the newspapers were all over this, and he promoted it in every way that he could, but he wound up having a lot of financial problems. So, like Albuquerque didn't want to pay, whatever it was that Pyle wanted, and so Pyle was like, all right, fine, we're not running through Albuquerque. So on the way, he had this whole thing mapped out, and then suddenly he's like, okay, not doing Albuquerque, we'll stay at this one place, and, whatever it was, I think was like a mountain or something, where there was no town. So he didn't make it, he made no money probably that night. There, by the time he started off in a big camper, luxury camper, which 1928, that was a huge, big, new thing. And by the time somewhere in the middle of the race, he loses the camper because he can't make the payment. So, he wound up having a lot of financial grief on this trip. So by the end, he was doing everything he could just to keep it going, And one of the big problems that he had, or one of the things that he should have rethought, was starting off in California. If he had started off in New York, the terrain, is quite nice and the weather's, fine and all that. He started people running, they're running through the mountains and the desert. And so by the time people got to Arizona, there were a lot of people who had dropped out. There were a lot of people who dropped out that first day or two. They're running up a mountain in, work boots. I think that guy, the work boots guy, lasted a little while. But, running barefoot, a lot of people had problems. So, yeah, I think if he had started off in New York like he did, there was a second race in 1929, and that started off in New York. But yeah, I think he might have had better luck if he had, rethought the route. But yeah, Route 66, and it just, for him, I guess he thought starting in L.A. would be a great idea.
Are there any people that stood out in your research from sort of from the runners group? Some names that I came across that are just either they were sort of trying to prove a point or make some money from a hard luck story. Obviously, there's a couple of angles of racism for some of the African American and Native American racers, which itself was a challenge. In addition to the sheer endurance part of it, right, just makes it doubly hard. Any names of people that sort of stand out, sort of in the process, and the winner, Johnny Sallow, the second year, but this guy Andy Payne, the first year. I'm just curious: is there any interesting or odd or unique stories in all of this, or is it just like an older version of maybe Survivor and just, people from all over the place and they just kind of go for it because they have their own particular reasons?
Well, both. I mean, there are some great stories. And yeah, there are several standouts. I mean, it is like the Survivor, like you said. I mean, just a motley group of people, who don't have a lot in common in some ways, but yeah, everybody I think who ran in this had some sort of interesting story. Ed Gardner, who I think you mentioned, but he was one of the 4 black runners in the race, and he had a lot of racism directed at him. In McLean, Texas, an angry mob surrounded his trainer's car and threatened to burn it, claiming that blacks had no business racing against whites. And Ed Gardner, by the way, came in 8th, so he did quite well. But in Western Oklahoma, a farmer had a shotgun, followed him, for quite a while. I think the entire day, and daring him to pass a white man. So I assume that day didn't do as well running. But yeah, I mean, Ed was just had a lot of just terrible, unthinkable things. You can just imagine the epithets and all of that, and it's just terrible. But as I said, he came in 8th, and he ended up doing great. And then Norman Cotalupi, I love his story. He was 19 years old when he met Mary. Okay, they lived in Cleveland. They were both working in a mayonnaise factory. Now, Mary was Hungarian, and Norman's family was Italian. And the Italians back then, in the late 1920s, weren't too fond of Hungarians because they were on different sides in World War I. So Norman's family sends him to California to live with an uncle and work there and, get Mary out of the system. So he's working in California, and what does Norman hear about but this Bunion Derby race? So he gets this idea. He's like, the race, it's going through Cleveland, where I lived. So he's like, if I can, raise $125, I've got a good excuse to go back to Cleveland. Now, of course, if he can raise $125, he could just travel there himself. But he thought, well, if I raise $125, I can run to Cleveland. I'll drop out. I'll get my $100, for travel money, and then we can, I'll use that as a nest egg, and I'll marry Mary. So, talk about a reason, for running this. I just loved it. Anyway, he runs, and he makes it to Cleveland, but then he's like, I ran all this way, and I'm going to stop? So he keeps going, but he does meet up with Mary. He gives her a piece of petrified wood that he picked up in the petrified forest in Arizona, and he gives it to her as a souvenir, and then he keeps running. And he ends up finishing in 27th place, but he does marry Mary. And then, they live in Cleveland, and he's got his own garage, and they have a happy life. And I don't know. I love that story. Mike Kelly, he was a stunt man, an amazing character. He didn't do too well, but I think he finished the race, if I remember. And then it was kind of like after the race, Mike Kelly was like, well, now what? So I think he ran in the second race, but then he kept doing things, endurance fads. Even long after it was over, he kept doing them, and then finally was killed doing some stunt. But just amazing stuff. And then Andy Payne, you mentioned him. He won the race, and that's where I wound up spending the night, like 1 or 2 nights in his daughter's guest home, and looking through all the scrapbooks and everything. And in a way, he was, I hate to say this, I was thinking about it today, I was like, it was kind of not as much fun to write about him because he was such a good person. You had C.C. Pyle, who, was shifty and all that, and then a lot of people with hard luck stories. And Andy Payne was, he was a teenager, I think 19 when he ran it. And he had a great story, too. He wanted to impress a girl that he liked, Vivian. And she was just like a year older, but she was his school teacher when he was in school. And so he couldn't ask her out, and she's older. She's only like 6 months older, something like that. Excuse me. But anyway, but he goes out to run the race because he's thinking, well, if I win $25,000, Vivian, maybe she'll notice me and like me and all that. And he wrote to her during the race and all that. And, he ends up winning, and then he ends up marrying her and and all that. And then you would think, okay, he wins this race. Andy Payne, he's going to run, and C.C. Pyle, very excited, okay, because he's like, well, Andy Payne, I'm going to be his agent, and I'm going to make a lot of money off Andy Payne. So later, after the Bunion Derby, C.C. Pyle organizes a big race, promotes it really heavily. It's between Andy Payne and another elite runner, and so they run the race. And Andy develops some cramps, and he quits after 10 miles. And he never runs again. This is, after running the entire country. So, and then I don't know if you have more time, how much time, but Paul Hardrock, I could tell you about him.
Sure.
He was.
By the way, but before you go for Payne, Payne was also a Native American, right? He was a part of the Cherokee tribe. That's even another.
Yeah, I should mention that.
Yeah.
And that's a neat thing. And then later he becomes a member of the House of Representatives in Oklahoma. As I said, a really good person. He was the opposite of C.C. Pyle. It really, if you're going to look for like good versus evil, or good versus flawed evil, I would not call C.C. Pyle evil, but he was a character. But yeah, Andy Payne just, led a great life, married a wonderful woman, had 2 kids, a son and a daughter, and just, was just this, just a wonderful person from everything I've, never got to meet him. I got to talk to his wife briefly on the phone. She was in her 90s, and then she died before I, came out to Oklahoma. But, I met a lot of his family members, and he's just a wonderful guy. And then Paul Hardrock, if you want me to get into him, I was going to say it was funny because after the race, he becomes a mailman. So, he walks for the rest of his career. But he made a name for himself before, a name locally. He was from Burlington, North Carolina, and he was a college student, and he wanted, when he entered the race, and he wanted the $25,000 so he could, graduate and, have college money. And somebody suggested that he try, he had to raise the $125, and that was not easy. So somebody suggested that if he was a little more, famous, maybe people would chip in and all that. And so somehow they came up with this idea, because he was a really good runner, that he would race a pony, actually, named Maud. And so he ran this race with Maud, and it wound up being like a 75-mile race. I think they did it over 3 days because they didn't want to kill anybody. And so, for like 3 days, they ran this race, and you would think that, the pony would definitely come in, be faster. But I think each day, it was almost like a tie. And finally, in the 3rd day, Paul hurt something, one of his ligaments, and he had to drop out. But then they heard that, like, the horse was done, just could not run anymore. And so they kind of declared it a tie. And then later, as, people start telling the story, somebody said, oh, the horse died, and that became part of the legend. The horse pony did not die. But it was just a great, and Paul, when he was training for the race, he was hit by a car. When he was running the race with Maud, he runs into a drugstore and grabs a thing of milk and just guzzles it, and then says to the guy, my trainer's coming by in a car, he'll pay for it. And then he runs, and the drugstore owner, he's like, wow, but he ends up giving him the milk on the house because he's just impressed, with Paul Hardrock. Anyway, there's so many stories. It's an amazing, human nature and it's just a wonderful human interest story.
So this though, it ends up in Madison Square Garden. I'm guessing there's it's almost like a Milrose Games like thing where people kind of enter the stadium and they kind of run around a track and stuff and all that.
Exactly. Yeah.
So is the New York press all over this? Are they just is this just like I got to think this is almost an probably in his mind, Pyle, this would be sort of an exclamation point, right? Finishing in the major media market in the country and all that.
Yeah, and what's so wild is it didn't do too well. The media, they were all over it. But one, you had everybody running through New York, and I think a lot of people just thought, do I really want to pay, the entry fee to go into Madison Square Garden and watch these people run around a track for 24 hours or 20, maybe it wasn't that long, but, for hours. And a lot of people were like, nah, that's okay. So he didn't make a lot of money. And the 55, there were 55 runners who finished out of 199, which, is really pretty remarkable. But these 55 men were broken. This was not a race exactly at this point. First of all, the way you won this race was, the shortest amount of time that you could, it was a race for sure. Every day, you would log in your time. So from town A to town B, if you got there in 4 hours and somebody else got there in 7 hours, well, that person with 4 hours, they're they're in great shape. So Andy Payne, after a while, I think like Ohio, you start adding it up and looking at everything and you're like, Andy Payne's probably going to win this, if he keeps it up, if he doesn't break a leg or something or get hit by a car, which that happened to some people, he might just win this. So everybody knew that Andy Payne was going to win. That was another thing too. John Salo came in second. Well, everybody knew he was going to come in second. Again, the only thing that could really trip you up was like shoelace at this point. So yeah, it wasn't much of a moneymaker for C.C. Pyle. And, which to me adds to the story in a lot of ways. Sure, it would have been great if it was like, the movie Breaking Away or Rocky, and you've got, suddenly at the last minute, Andy Payne, passes John Salo and wins the money and all. But no, it was an endurance, fad, and it was an endurance, competition. And so, yeah, it wasn't like, oh my God, who's going to win? It's like, can they continue running? And at that point, yeah, you kind of knew Andy Payne would win. So, Will Rogers, I haven't mentioned him. He covered the race. He was along in the race for quite a while. It was a big deal for the country. But at the same time, I think everybody kind of forgot about it. It was, and if you think about it, there was no TV. You had radio, but even radio was not yet a huge thing. So it was really, you read about it in the newspaper and you went to see it, and then it's gone. It's done. So it's like one really interesting day if you're in the middle of, Indiana, Illinois, and you see this race come through town. Of course, if you're in Florida, you don't see it. If you're in Texas, you don't see it. So I think it was kind of an easy when I think about it, it's, you can see why people did forget about it after a while.
So if he didn't make a bunch of money sort of off of this, which seems like he kind of, I don't know, broke even at best, right? Maybe even less than that, right? But he
at least was able to give everybody their prize money, which, I found kind of amazing.
I wonder if there were people who even doubted that prize money would actually be made good.
Yeah. They did. Yeah, nobody thought they were gonna get it. But I think he was like, well, if I'm gonna do this again, and he did, he was like, I'd better come up with the money, and he did. So
all right. So then I guess the big question then is, why try it again in 29? And again, to put this in context, this is this race, the original race happens in March and through May of 1928. I'm guessing it's around the same time the next year. But I'm just curious as to why he tries it again. There are a couple of different sort of tweaks to it, right? In New York to L.A. versus the other way around.
Yes. Yeah, and I think a lot of it, I'm sure he thought, well, we did it. It didn't, wasn't pretty, but we did it. And now that I've got all the kinks worked out, it'll go great. And it's funny, I didn't write about it much in the book. I mean, I mentioned it, of course. But I didn't do a whole lot of research on the race because I was kind of, I guess, like C.C. Pyle, a little deluded, and thought, this book is going to be such a bestseller that I'll write a sequel, and I'll write a sequel about the race, because the 1929 race was pretty crazy too. But and if memory serves me, they did not get their prize money at the end of that one, which would explain why there wasn't a 1931. But also there wasn't one in 1930 because the Great Depression started, and that just kind of messed everything up. But yeah, I think he decided to do a second one because he really did want to do an annual one, and he did think that it was going to go a lot better. And as I recall, I think C.C. Pyle broke his leg on the second race. Lots of things went wrong in that second race. But yeah, and then so after the 1929 Transcontinental race, he gives up, and he pretty much goes back into sort of obscurity. He tries to do, tries to make money. I think he starts working for some movie studio, but it doesn't go very far or anything. But he did. He married his fourth wife after the race, and there's a really interesting thing. Trying to look at my notes here and see what her name. It's like Elvina. Well, yeah,
she's like a famous comedian or something, right?
Yes, she's a comedian, and nobody's
Elvia
really heard
Allman.
of her.
I think it's Elvia Allman.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
No, last name is actually Tortelat.
Right.
Elvia Allman Tortelat. Yes. Easy to say.
Yeah,
you say it 3 times fast. Go ahead.
Everybody knows her. If you've ever seen I Love Lucy, she's the foreman on the chocolate factory. So she's the one who, shouts faster, faster, and Lucy and Ethel are like grabbing the chocolates and stuffing them in their mouths. Well, that's her. She was also Selma Prout on the Petticoat Junction. So I find
I think she was also on the Beverly Hillbillies too. Yeah, so she was quite well known.
Not hugely famous, but I think everybody remembers that. Most people, of at least, maybe my daughters don't. They've barely watched I Love Lucy, but yeah, in a way, she became kind of more famous than C.C. Pyle, which it's kind of sad, but yeah, he was an amazing guy.
You know what? And here's a very interesting story. I've been just completely, and I'm just quickly doing some quick research what I didn't know. I've been actually watching old episodes of The Odd Couple because on this Decades channel, they've been running the entire series in order over the last number of weeks. And it turns out that she appeared as Oscar Madison's mother in one episode of The Odd Couple. If you remember the Greek restaurant belly dancer episode, she was the mom of Oscar's affectionate towards her daughter. Hilarious.
I love The Odd Couple.
Who would know?
Check that out.
But it does speak, I guess, to Pyle's sort of flair for promotion and the business, if you will. Of course, by the business I mean the industry, as Paul Schaefer would have said on Letterman. He clearly enjoyed, I think, sort of being part of that sort of spotlight, even if he wasn't in that spotlight.
Oh yeah, and I feel bad for him in a lot of ways because he would have probably he would have killed it now, with social media, and just, in banking, he had a lot of money problems, but now with, digital money and Zelle and, all, getting money to people fast and all that. I mean, he probably, if he was around today and wanted to host it, and, I'm sure he could, without losing his shirt, without losing his reputation. But yeah, back then, 1928, it was just a lot harder. But that's why it's kind of amazing to, not only to him, but all the runners, that they were able to do what they did, with those, with the shoe wear of 1928 and the roads, and the weather. I mean, this was over, it was March, April, May, most of May. It ended May 26th. And, they were rained on and snowed on and, I think windstorms and, running through the desert. They ran through just about everything. And a couple runners had nervous breakdowns. A couple runners were hit by cars. Knees gave out, and just the broken, fallen arches. I mean, Charlie horses. I can't imagine what it must have been like, or I can't imagine. That's what's so fun. But, you get to your tent. Well, and that was an interesting thing too, that if somebody like Andy Payne, if you got to your town, the finish line at 3 p.m., we've got the rest of the day at least to recover. And then the next day you get up, get a good night's sleep. Next day you get up and you're able to run. If you were coming in at midnight, as some of these runners were, and at that point nobody's there, no cheering crowds for you. I mean, everybody's gone to bed, but the referee is there and count your time. You're staggering in at midnight or 1 a.m. and you're getting up the next morning like 6 or 7. You're in even worse shape. You've had no time really to recover, and then you're running again. So, yeah, if you got ahead in this race, you probably were going to do pretty well. And if you didn't do so well, and it's amazing that a lot of these people, they knew that they weren't going to win. But I think, when you get to somewhere like Missouri, Illinois, you just think, I can't stop now, Like Norman Cotalupi was going to run to Cleveland, but then he's like, I'll never forgive myself if I don't try to finish this.
All right, two questions to kind of sort of bring it home here. And there's sort of more overarching ones and more, I guess, sort of personal thoughts and your own sort of ideas of the trajectory of this. So number one, I guess, is why did sort of this ultra marathon or cross country kind of thing takes so long, I guess, to kind of be rediscovered? I mean, the idea, it seems to me, didn't sort of even come back into people's consciousness until the 60s or the 70s. Why, if it was such an interesting concept, and if not for the economic challenges of a Great Depression, I'm just curious as to why it took so long, I guess, for the idea of doing something along these lines again took so long to come back into possibility and reality.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I don't think we've ever really done anything quite like this, since then. I mean, in terms of, a transcontinental race, I'm sure I think there have been, but nothing, on that
running,
scale.
I guess the point is, I think running has become such in the 70s, certainly it was a boom and a rediscovery, I guess, of running and the shoe manufacturing and the sneakers and all that stuff, right?
Yeah, I see what you mean. I do think that, I'm sure that shoe manufacturing probably helped a lot. The running interest was always there. I mean, it was there before C.C. Pyle. There were, professional runners. The Boston Marathon, was around. But you had 168 people, I think, was a typical in 1927. I think there were 168 runners. And now, when there's not a pandemic, you have like 40,000, 50,000 people. That's a lot of people, running one marathon. So I think that, but I think, as shoes developed and got better, that obviously helped. I think one reason, the Bunion Derby was sort of forgotten and all these endurance fads sort of petered out was, the Great Depression. It's interesting how it was sort of bookended the 1920s by, World War I, the pandemic, the influenza, and then, you've got these great 1920s, and then suddenly that Great Depression, then World War II. So by the 50s, you've got, America's normal again, and you don't have, you have the Korean War, but it's, on a much better kind of even keel. 1960s, of course, were rough, and then the 1970s, actually, if you think about it, were probably, even though, yes, there were, strife going on. It was a pretty sedate decade. Well, the Vietnam War. All right. There was no good time, no peaceful time. But anyway, I don't know. Somewhere in the 1970s, as you said, running became a huge thing. And as I mentioned, sort of in a rambling thing earlier, the, women started running the Boston Marathon and marathons in general, in the 1960s, 1970s. So then you had both genders running, and and I do think the sneakers probably just, and you just had gurus. I can't remember some of their names, but there were some big, influential people sort of promoting the sport, and
I think it also speaks to it's an inexpensive sport, right? A pair of shoes and yourself and running, and it's very solitary, and it's your own sort of pushing yourself. There's no sort of teams and leagues to organize and all that kind of stuff. And I think that's kind of, maybe I'm just struggling I'm just curious as to the spectacle of all of that and how seemingly intriguing it was, and the stories and the people that were attracted to it. It just sort of lay fallow for years and years and years and years. Now the idea of ultra marathons and triathlons and Ironman, all that stuff, right, is still amazing. And obviously there's money and promotion and marketing around all that kind of stuff. But I just find it interesting that nobody in the many decades since really never attempted something spectacle-wise, especially given now media being so, and television in particular, right? That and who knows, maybe it will come back again because, as Barnum says, there's a sucker born every minute. So it's just interesting to me that and I think this adds to the legend of this story. It's like you can't believe something like this would have happened just in general, let alone in the specific time of it. And largely because it hasn't really come back in any way, shape, or form of similar variety.
Yeah, and you raised an interesting point earlier about the insurance. Back then I don't remember coming across too much about insurance. The insurance industry was still pretty, kind of in its infancy back then. You had it, but I don't think you insured, things like that. But today you'd have to. And, and they ran on roads where there were cars, people driving, but, there weren't a lot of cars. But today, you couldn't do that. You couldn't, on Route 66 or any route. You could, but you'd be like, you'd close it off to the public. And they didn't do that back then. So, that would be yet another thing. It would be a really quite a challenge and very expensive to put together something like a Transcontinental foot race now. I think you could do it, but because it's not like you close off the whole road for the whole country, like one giant freeway, for months. You just day by day you'd close off sections, but yeah, it was a huge undertaking back then, and I think it's appreciated now by the people who hear about it, but. Yeah, sadly, it's been kind of forgotten.
All right, here's a last question. Where's the movie for all of this? It seems like there's just great stories and drama. I know there was an attempt, I guess, in the mid or early 1980s to do a Broadway play around it. I think Paul Newman's name was attached to it. Jerome Robbins was supposedly part of the production of it and all that stuff. But it hasn't. Nothing really of significance has really sort of hit the silver screen or big stage.
I know. It's just sad. I mean, you would think that it would make a great movie, and I bet someday, maybe they will. But I don't know why it hasn't happened. I mean, I did, I spoke to one producer before I even wrote the book. My agent got me some talk with a producer, and and this person wanted to know about the love interest between Andy Payne and Vivian, and I think he thought there wasn't enough there or something, and he was I think he wanted me to play that up, but I was like, I can only play it up as much as it's history, and I don't know. I mean,
that's never stopped anybody before. I'm watching The Crown right now, and the literary licenses probably taken with that of the royal family over the decades, right? And the centuries, right?
I will say everything in the book that I've got, is everything came from newspapers, the family members. It's all like real. You don't have to make this story up. I mean, it was. You really don't have to take any literary license. In that sense, C.C. Pyle got what he wanted, because he really did put on an amazing show, and there's heartbreak and humor, and I mean and I'm not talking about my book. I mean, I'm just saying the history is incredible. It's just a really rich history, and in a way, I think what's kind of cool is that it was, it was just meant to be a fun event. It's an historical event. It's not like on par with, the Civil War, the Great Depression, or, the throwing the tea in the Boston Harbor. I mean, it's not. You could say it's not an important event, but it's a really quirky, interesting glimpse of our history almost 100 years ago, and and what people would do for money, and a lot of these people, they were trying to get money for the right reasons. I mean, that kid who wanted to help his paraplegic father. I mean, and that's a nice little story too. I mentioned he was one of the 4 black runners, and members of the black community, after Will Rogers wrote about him, they raised about $1,000 and gave it to him and another black runner as well. And so, I don't know, it was just neat to, hear stories like that. But yeah, it was an amazing, just a really colorful, amazing time in history.
All right, amazingly interesting stuff. I have a feeling that we're going to probably figure out some other ways to get into more of this story, both specifically around these 2 races, but also, frankly, the bigger story around this C.C. Pyle guy, founding the original American Football League and 4 of the teams that were involved in it. His sports representation of people like Red Grange and part of the Chicago Bears and the barnstorming and all that kind of stuff. But of course, this foot race, this Bunion Derby thing, many other stories yet to. And look, as I mentioned, I am just shocked. While there has been an attempt to do a stage play around this, you got to think at some point, especially in the era of streaming and sort of limited series and whatnot, a story. A television / video presentation of this guy, perhaps these races, is in the offing. This just seems to have all the ingredients of just crazy and interesting personalities, and certainly the time, the Roarin' 20s for sure. What a time it must have been for Pyle, these races, and just sports generally, and just the the nature of what was going on around the country at that time before it all sort of came crashing to a halt. But if you want to dig into to the story, the book is fantastic. It's called C.C. Pyle's Amazing Foot Race, the true story of the 1928 coast-to-coast run across America. It was by our guest, Geoff Williams. You can find that wherever good books are sold. It is published by Tantor Media. And of course, you can search up this episode on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com and find this episode number 200, our conversation with Geoff Williams. And there will be not only a description of this show and some great imagery and stuff around the events that we talked about, but also a convenient link to this book on Amazon, which you can obviously by clicking that link through our website, you'll be giving us a few shekels of goodness to help keep our lights on. But then it also allows you to get the book in any kind of format that you want. You want it in the original hardcover or paperback, shipped via Prime and get it to your doorstep within the next day or so. How about it as an audiobook? You can get it in that format, as well as in Kindle too, of course. All of those versions are available to you when you click through our link to Amazon. And again, our website, again, is goodseatsstillavailable.com. That's where you're going to find all of our 200 or so episodes. We post them all there for you to conveniently search and find and stream them as you might like, or download them. Of course, the easiest way to keep abreast of what's going on with the show is to subscribe, for God's sakes. Just go to Apple or Google Podcasts or Amazon or Pandora or Spotify, you name them. We're everywhere you can basically find podcasts. Just subscribe to us. It's simple. And while you're doing that, why not give us a nice 5-star rating and then some? We appreciate that too. That helps our little algorithm find other people like you who might like this show. And we appreciate that to no end, of course. On our website, of course, is all of our social media links. You'll find us on Facebook. You'll see a link to us on Instagram. We're at Good Seats Still Available. On Twitter, you'll find us at Good Seats Still. If you want to send us some email, go right ahead. We're at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. You can also subscribe to our weekly email newsletter off the website. Just click around. You'll find a convenient link to that. And gosh, I think that's about it. Jerry Payne, we thank you, kind sir, of course, for all your twiddling of knobs and then some this week for this week's episode. Jerry Payne, Audio Excellence. Tip of the cap to you, sir, in metropolitan Atlanta. And a humble bow in the general direction of just about every listener that we can see and feel in our internet delivery mechanisms this week. Thank you very much for listening. We couldn't have done it without you. On to 201 next week. Who knows what the topic will be, but it'll be fun, I assure you that. Thanks for listening. Until then, take care. Bye-bye.